Do you ever find it difficult to know or what to believe is good for you? And as a general rule, if you use basic intuition, it would seem that if something is labeled by experts as being good for us, then more should be better, right? Or if something is labeled as bad for us, we should avoid it at all costs. And so, for example, if you first heard that exercise is critical to living a healthy life, some of us, unfortunately present company excluded, chose to get out on the roads and sidewalks and then run for hours and hours on end, sometimes even damaging our bodies in the process. Or when doctors said that red meat isn't as good for us as some other foods, many people began to start eating chicken instead of red meat, and subsequently may have turned the enjoyment and pleasure of mealtime into something that was a little bit more, routine. Or if vitamins are good for us, why don't we simply, chew them by the handful? Or if a good night's rest is important to us, why doesn't everybody on their day off sleep 12 hours a day? Or if butter and whole milk and cheese cause you problems, why don't eliminate them altogether? And how happy were people to hear that alcohol and dark chocolate have some medicinal benefits, and how many of you have upped the intake of both of them, right? Of course, what we know about what is good and bad for us, doesn't that change over the years too? Something that may have been good, then new research and tests come out, now all of a sudden it's bad for us, and then before you know it, it's good for us again then too. Coffee seems to fall in that line one way or another. But, the notion that we should strive to get as much of the good things and deny ourselves of every bad thing, that's not really what the experts tell us, is it? In almost every case when these studies are done and presented to the public, we're all told something very simple and very helpful, and it's this: everything in moderation, right? You've heard that all before. Everything in moderation. 3 simple words, and yet there seems to be a whole lot of wisdom connected in them. And at some level, it makes perfect sense. A good balance being better than any sort of extreme behavior. And so you may say that, okay, an occasional glass of wine or a cocktail in the evening is okay, but drinking a 12-pack every night is not okay. And enjoying red meat a few times a week won't do you much harm, if any, but eating 21 meals a week is probably not a good thing. And running a few miles 4 to 5 times a week, is good for our heart and overall health, but doing 20 miles a day will probably do more harm than good. Spending 80 to 90 hours at work week after week can significantly disrupt our sleep habits, our overall mental well-being, and even our relationship with our spouses and children. And of course, even dark chocolate or coffee might be somewhat good for us, but no one would suggest consuming them every waking minute, right? Everything in moderation. But is that true of everything? Is the middle way always the best way? Or are there exceptions? Well, both in today's first reading and from the first book of Kings and in our gospel readings from a gospel passage from Mark, we're presented with 2 somewhat similar stories. In the first story, a widow and her son appear to be near death, maybe from starvation, and yet she takes the little food that she has left and gives it to Elijah at his request. And even in her despair, she is willing to look beyond herself, willing to consider the needs of another before her own. And miraculously, somehow, some way, through the incredible goodness of God, she and her son were able to eat for a year without running out of food. And in the gospel story today, Jesus affirms a poor widow whom he saw putting a couple of small coins into the treasury. And even though some wealthy people put in much greater amounts, Jesus tells his disciples that the poor widow actually gave more than the others because she gave from her poverty and not from her surplus wealth. Everything in moderation. Is that what's going on here in what we heard in the scriptures? Hardly. The moderate thing, the measured thing, maybe even the more prudent and practical thing would have been to simply apologize and decline to help or decline to give, explaining that times were tough and that they really didn't have anything to give. And you know what? No one would have faulted either widow if that was the answer that she gave. In fact, virtually every single one of us in that exact same situation would almost certainly have said something along the lines of, "Don't worry about it. I understand completely." And the reason is simple. Often when we are in similar situations, we'd rather not give either. Give from our excess? No problem. Give from our want? Well, that's a different story. Evidently, when it comes to the spiritual life, we also like things in moderation, don't we? A little bit of praying, a little bit of giving, a few kind words, a little bit of the right thing, a little bit of looking out for others, not too much. We don't have to go crazy, we don't have to go overboard or anything like that, but not too little either, just enough. Well, I guess you could say that when it comes to loving in all forms, we only like to love some of the time, but not all. We only like to love in some situations, but not all. We only like to love some people, but not all. And why is that? There could be two reasons for that. One reason, of course, is that loving is really hard at times. In some situations, being just about the last thing we want to do, even though our loving God made us precisely for that reason to love. Go back to the old Baltimore Catechism for that one. Unfortunately, our own mixed motives, our pride and our selfishness and our sin also get in the way. And secondly, maybe we choose to not love too much because deep down we simply don't think that we have enough to give, that we really don't have what it takes, or that our love will somehow run out. Well, the widow in the first reading teaches us the exact opposite. Faith can often surprise us like that. The remarkable, surprising truth is that when it comes to things of God, when it comes to holy things, we can give, and we can give, and we can give, and we will always have more to give. Our God, thankfully, is a God of profound abundance. And so that's the challenge that we face today. The challenge to stop doing God things, holy things, in moderation. God doesn't want lukewarm efforts. God doesn't want us always calculating the costs. God doesn't want us to carefully measure out our kindness and mercy and compassion as if it's some kind of recipe in which we have to get the amounts just right. Put simply, God wants us to stop asking ourselves, how much can I afford to give? Instead, he wants us to think about a different question. How can I afford not to give? Both of the widows got that one right. Can we get it right too?